Jack Miller's return to Bakersfield was a quiet one, marked by a heavy cloud of unresolved pain and a fierce resolve. The ex-Marine, toughened by years on the front lines, looked around the streets of his hometown with a mix of familiarity and disdain. So much of the city was the same, gritty and neglected, haunted by its own history. Yet, for Jack, everything felt different. Years ago, he had left Bakersfield, eager to escape memories that clung to him like scars. But now, as he rolled into town on his old beat-up motorcycle, he knew he was back for one reason only: justice. Memories of fallen friends resurfaced, ones like Mike, a fellow Marine, whose return to civilian life had been cut short by the brutal violence of a gang that had claimed part of the city. Mike had been his brother in arms, the kind of friend Jack knew he would risk his life for. But Mike hadn't died overseas. He'd been gunned down in his own neighborhood, left to bleed out on a darkened street corner. Jack had tried to seek answers, to push for accountability, but all he found was the thick wall of police corruption that choked any path to justice. Instead of finding justice, he found a system that looked the other way, turning gangsters into untouchable forces. Now back in Bakersfield, Jack intended to protect what the authorities had allowed to slip away, to reclaim what his friend, and so many others, had lost. Standing at a gas station just outside town, Jack fueled up his bike, a relic of past journeys, its faded paint and weathered engine a testament to its many miles. The silence of the evening was punctuated by the growl of approaching motorcycles. Jack glanced up, watching as three riders, clad in leather and smirking with a dangerous confidence, pulled in and parked near him. The leader, a bulky, bearded figure with an unhinged grin, sauntered toward Jack. "Nice bike, old man," the leader sneered, his eyes assessing Jack's ride with open contempt. "Did you bring it back from the war, or is it just all you could afford?" His name was Red, a local bully and leader of the notorious Red Devils, a gang known for its brazen violence and reign over Bakersfield's underworld. With him were his cronies, Ricky and Snake, who laughed and echoed their leader's taunts. "Is that all that's left of the great Marine Jack Miller?" Red jeered, drawing out his words with mocking emphasis. "An old bike and some washed-up memories?" Jack stayed calm, his face an unreadable mask. He'd faced worse threats before, much worse, but even so, his body betrayed him. A faint shiver of anger crawled up his spine, sparking an all-too-familiar feeling. He was back in that street, seeing Mike lying lifeless, the anguish of that moment resurfacing. But he forced himself to breathe, centering his thoughts. The gang members laughed, circling him like vultures. Red's taunts became sharper. "You come back here thinking you can save the city," he sneered. "Maybe you should have stayed away. Nobody here needs you." Jack's fists clenched reflexively, but he held back, his mind racing through the principles of restraint and defense drilled into him in the service. He wasn't here to pick fights, but he also wouldn't back down. When Red finally took it one step further, pushing Jack with force that sent him stumbling back, Jack's patience snapped. With precise, almost surgical movement, he drove a solid uppercut into Red's jaw. Red staggered, his sneer replaced by stunned shock as he stumbled backward. Jack's movement was a fluid response, years of combat training guiding him instinctively. The bystanders, people filling their tanks or watching from their cars, looked on in surprise, some with admiration, others with fear. Ricky and Snake moved in immediately, their faces twisted in anger. Jack sidestepped a punch from Ricky, reaching for a nearby can of motor oil and throwing it at Snake, who slipped and lost his footing. Jack turned quickly, blocking Ricky's advance with a swift, well-aimed kick that sent him reeling back. Yet, he was painfully aware that he was outnumbered and outgunned. He reached for anything nearby, a stray wrench, a loose piece of concrete, as makeshift weapons, deflecting and dodging as best as he could. The fight was brutal, a clash of brute force against honed skill. Despite his training, Jack could feel his strength waning. His lungs burned with each breath, and sweat stung his eyes. He was reaching his limit, and Red, regaining his footing, lunged toward him again, a dangerous glint in his eye. The blows came hard and fast, and Jack felt his body absorbing more damage than he could give back. It was starting to look grim, until the sudden blaring sound of sirens filled the air. The police cars pulled in, their lights flashing in the dimness of the gas station. Officers jumped out, and the crowd parted, murmuring as the tension finally broke. The police quickly stepped in, restraining Red, Ricky, and Snake. Red, still smirking as he was cuffed, stared at Jack with a look of pure malice. "This isn't over, soldier," he muttered, his voice dripping with venom. "I'll be back, and next time, you won't be so lucky." Jack met Red's gaze, his own expression cold and unyielding. "I'll be waiting," he replied, his voice low but steady. The challenge was clear, and the onlookers, now dispersing, knew they had witnessed the beginning of something much larger than a mere skirmish. As Jack caught his breath, a figure approached him from the group of officers. Sergeant Ray Cooper, an older, grizzled cop who had served Bakersfield for decades. Cooper gave Jack a look of recognition and respect. "You sure know how to make an entrance," Cooper said, his tone both amused and grave. "You're biting off a big chunk here, Jack. These guys, they don't play by any rules." Jack nodded, his face set in determination. "Neither do I when it comes to people like them." With a weary sigh, Cooper offered him a ride, hinting at the complex web of influence the Red Devils had in the city, a web that seemed to entangle even some of the men in blue. As they drove, Jack listened, every word deepening his resolve. The police intervention at the gas station had been swift but tense, dispersing the crowd and forcing the gang members to keep their distance from Jack, who stood bruised and breathless but resolute. Amidst the flashing lights, Sergeant Ray Cooper, a seasoned veteran of the Bakersfield Police Department, sized up the situation. The gang members eyed Jack with barely contained hostility, restrained but defiant as they were forced against the squad cars. Red, handcuffed but still grinning with twisted satisfaction, fixed his gaze on Jack, his voice a venomous whisper as he sneered, "This isn't over, soldier. You'll see me again." Jack, unmoved, held Red's gaze without a flinch. His answer was firm and calm. "I'll be waiting." The two men stared each other down, the air thick with a personal vendetta that was far from over. The bystanders, still lingering out of curiosity, watched the exchange, sensing the rivalry simmering just below the surface. The fight at the gas station had been more than an isolated confrontation. It was the beginning of a battle that felt inevitable. Once the crowd had fully dispersed, Cooper motioned Jack to follow him to his squad car. Leaning against the door, Cooper looked at Jack with a mixture of concern and admiration. "You're taking on quite a storm, Jack," he said, his voice low. "These guys don't stop, and you can bet they don't forget either. Especially Red. He's got more power in this city than you'd think." Jack gave a slight nod, his face impassive but determined. He knew Cooper wasn't exaggerating. The grip the Red Devils had on Bakersfield was more than a street-level nuisance. They were enmeshed in the city's framework, protected by hidden allies in powerful positions. "Hop in," Cooper said finally, gesturing for Jack to get into the car. The drive was short but heavy with implication. Once they were out of earshot of the others, Cooper shared a confession, his voice barely above a whisper. "Listen, Jack," he began. "Some of us have tried to get rid of these guys before. We've pushed and pulled, but there are always strings being pulled above us. This gang isn't just a bunch of low-life bikers. They're protected, and some folks in this department might be helping keep it that way." Jack's face tightened as he absorbed the information. Corruption. He'd sensed it before, years ago, and now Cooper's words confirmed it. Bakersfield wasn't just under siege from the Red Devils, it was rotting from within. His thoughts drifted back to Mike, the friend he'd lost, and the memories of how that tragedy had been swept under the rug, written off as an unsolved crime. The anger burned anew, fueling his resolve. But he kept his voice steady. "I didn't come back to let things slide, Ray. Somebody has to make a stand." Cooper shot him a wary glance, weighing Jack's words. "I get that, Jack. But listen, if you're going to do this, You can't go charging in like a one-man army. These guys have too much cover, too many places to hide. And they've got connections you wouldn't believe. Keep a low profile, at least until you understand what you're dealing with." But Jack shook his head, his voice a hard whisper. "Keeping a low profile won't change anything, Ray. I've spent years watching from the sidelines. I can't just sit back anymore." With a heavy sigh, Cooper extended his hand, a silent agreement passing between them. They were on the same side, united by an unspoken understanding of the risks involved. When they arrived at Jack's place, Cooper's parting words echoed in Jack's mind. "Just don't underestimate them, Jack. They're more than you're used to. And they play dirtier." As Jack made his way into his apartment, he replayed the day's events, the tension in Red's face as he made his threats, the way the police presence had only fueled the gang's hostility. The Red Devils were no small-time operation. They thrived on fear and control. Jack felt the magnitude of the challenge settling over him, but his resolve remained unshaken. This was why he'd come back, to dismantle the hold these gangs had on his hometown and to honor the memory of his fallen friend. Later that night, as Jack mulled over his next steps, a sudden thought cut through his focus. His phone vibrated, the screen lighting up with an unknown number. Answering cautiously, he heard a low, distorted voice on the other end. "If you think a few cops are going to keep you safe, you're even dumber than I thought." The line clicked off before he could respond, but the message was clear. The Red Devils weren't just planning to let this go. They were watching him. The call reinforced the sense of danger lurking around every corner. He couldn't let himself be rattled, but he knew he needed allies. Ray Cooper was one, but he'd need more than one cop with a conscience to fight this war. Jack thought back to his days in the Marines, to the times when he and his squad had been outnumbered and outgunned but had somehow managed to prevail through sheer strategy and persistence. He'd need that same mindset now, that same iron will. And maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to rally others in Bakersfield who were equally fed up with the gang's reign. The next morning, Jack rose early, his mind already churning with plans. He had learned enough in the Marines to know that any stronghold could be brought down from within, but first, he'd need a way to expose the connections Red and his gang had with the city's leadership. He planned to start with the people who had been touched by the gang's violence, the families who had lost sons, the business owners threatened into silence. But he'd have to tread carefully. Even the smallest misstep could tip off the wrong people. By the time he stepped out of his apartment, he was already looking over his shoulder. Every passerby, every shadow felt like a potential threat. But he pressed on, his mind focused on the task. Bakersfield had become a war zone, and Jack was prepared to fight his way through it. As he began making inquiries around town, a familiar presence emerged alongside him. Sergeant Cooper. They exchanged a silent nod of understanding as they delved deeper into the town's underbelly, encountering whispers of payoffs, protection schemes, and silent alliances that kept the Red Devils untouchable. Cooper, his face lined with years of service and quiet frustration, offered a grim warning. "These guys have eyes everywhere, Jack. You're in for a rough ride." Jack shrugged, unfazed. "I've been through worse. This time, I'm not backing down." Their alliance was a fragile yet determined one, a partnership forged from necessity and shared convictions. As they parted ways that night, Jack knew that the days ahead would demand every ounce of his strength and cunning. The battle had only just begun, but Jack felt ready for the trials that lay ahead. The days that followed Jack's confrontation with the Red Devils were tense and quiet, a deceptive calm that made Jack's skin prickle with anticipation. He knew enough about the gang to expect retaliation, yet they remained curiously silent, watching him from the shadows but making no overt moves. His instincts told him that this was just the calm before the storm. One evening, as Jack sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, his phone buzzed. The caller ID displayed an unknown number, and he braced himself before answering. A distorted voice crackled through the line, barely audible above the static. "Old Rusty. Tonight, It instructed coldly before the line went dead. Jack knew immediately what this meant. The Red Devils had set up a meeting, and the bar's name, the Old Rusty, was infamous in Bakersfield as the gang's regular haunt. Steeling himself, Jack grabbed his jacket and headed out. The streets were nearly empty as he rode through the town, his senses heightened, eyes scanning every corner. The bar sat at the edge of town, its neon sign flickering weakly against the darkening sky. As Jack parked his bike, he noticed a few familiar faces loitering outside, all of them turning to watch him with hostile expressions. Inside, the bar was dim, filled with smoke and the murmur of low conversations that silenced the moment he stepped in. Jack's gaze locked onto Red, who lounged at a booth in the back, flanked by his cronies, Ricky and Snake. Red wore his usual smug grin, a predator sizing up his prey. He raised a glass, mocking Jack's arrival. "Welcome back, soldier," he drawled, his tone thick with sarcasm. "Didn't think you'd show." Jack ignored the taunt, stepping forward with a calm that belied the tension he felt. "You called me here, Red. So what do you want?" Red leaned back, spreading his arms with a smile that was anything but friendly. "We wanted to see if the big, bad Marine was really as tough as they say. Or maybe you just got lucky at the gas station." His cronies snickered, the sound grating against Jack's nerves. Red's eyes glinted with a dangerous challenge, his words laced with insinuations that hinted at unfinished business. The air in the bar was thick with unspoken threats as Jack and Red continued their exchange. Red's voice dropped, colder now. "See, we own this town, Miller. And you're just one man. You might have scared off a few of my boys, but that doesn't mean anything here." His gaze turned sharp, his smile fading. "This is our city, and we don't need a washed-up Marine playing hero." Jack clenched his fists, resisting the urge to lash out. He kept his voice steady. "Your grip on this city won't last forever. People are fed up, Red. They're tired of being afraid." He scanned the room, noting the wary eyes of a few patrons who looked away quickly, clearly intimidated by the gang's presence. Red laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "People don't care, Jack. They like order, even if it means looking the other way." He leaned in, lowering his voice to a venomous whisper. "But don't worry. We'll make sure they remember who's in charge. And you, soldier, you're just a distraction." Before Jack could respond, a firm hand settled on his shoulder. He turned to find Sergeant Ray Cooper standing behind him, his expression tense but calm. Cooper had slipped into the bar unnoticed, wearing plain clothes to avoid drawing attention. He leaned in close to Jack, his voice barely above a whisper. "We've got eyes on them tonight, Jack. Just play along." Jack nodded subtly, his gaze shifting back to Red. Cooper's presence was a silent assurance that he wasn't completely alone in this fight. "So what's it going to be, Red?" Jack asked, his voice hard, masking the slight relief he felt with Cooper nearby. "Are you going to keep hiding behind threats, or are you ready to face someone who doesn't scare that easily?" The taunt hit its mark, and Red's face darkened. He stood, his hands clenching into fists as he glared at Jack. "You think you're tough, Miller?" he spat. "We'll see how long you last." The moment stretched, thick with tension, until Red finally threw the first punch. Jack dodged, moving with a precision honed from years of military training. The bar erupted in chaos as Red's followers joined in, but Jack was ready. He countered their attacks with swift, calculated strikes, using every advantage the cramped space offered. He grabbed a nearby barstool, blocking a blow from Snake, then spun and used it to knock Ricky back. Red swung wildly, driven by fury more than skill, but Jack's movements were controlled, focused. Meanwhile, Cooper had slipped away, sending out a silent signal to his team outside. As the brawl intensified, more officers burst into the bar, moving quickly to detain the gang members. But in the chaos, Red slipped away, disappearing into the night before anyone could stop him. Jack watched him go, frustration simmering as the police rounded up the remaining gang members. The officers filed out with the detained gang members, and the bar fell silent, the damage left in the wake of the fight a testament to the brutality of the Red Devils. Jack slumped against the bar, catching his breath as Cooper approached him, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. "Red got away," Jack muttered, frustration evident in his voice. Cooper nodded, his expression resigned. "He's slippery. But tonight wasn't about catching him. We needed to see the kind of power he holds. And now, we've got some of his boys in custody." He placed a hand on Jack's shoulder, a look of understanding passing between them. "This was a win, Jack. Small, but it's a start." Jack knew Cooper was right. It was just the beginning, a small victory in a larger war. But seeing the fear in Red's eyes, if only for a moment, reminded him why he was fighting. This city needed someone to stand up, and Jack was ready to be that person. As they left the bar, Jack knew that Red wouldn't take this lightly. The next encounter would be even deadlier, and the Red Devils would stop at nothing to eliminate anyone who threatened their control. But for now, Jack savored the moment of victory, however fleeting, and steeled himself for the fight yet to come. The days following the ambush at Old Rusty were marked by unease, and Jack felt the stakes rising as the Red Devils tightened their grip on Bakersfield. Sergeant Ray Cooper, ever watchful, worked alongside Jack to piece together the gang's network, uncovering a web of corruption that went deep into the city's institutions. It was becoming clear that the Red Devils were more than a street gang. They were a criminal empire protected by powerful people who had a vested interest in keeping them untouchable. Late one night, Cooper called Jack to a secluded alley behind the precinct. "Jack," he whispered, his voice tinged with tension, "I found something, but we can't talk here. Too many ears." He glanced around cautiously before leading Jack to his car, where they drove in silence until they reached the deserted outskirts of town. The moon cast long shadows over the empty road as they parked. Cooper leaned close, his face lit only by the dim glow of the dashboard. "I've been digging," Cooper began, his tone hushed. "There's someone high up in the department on Red's payroll. Someone who's been protecting them from the inside for years. It's why they've managed to stay ahead, even with every raid and investigation." Jack felt his pulse quicken as he absorbed the implication. Someone on the inside was feeding the gang information, allowing them to evade capture and cement their control. "Who is it?" Jack demanded, his voice a low growl. But Cooper shook his head. "I don't have a name yet, just whispers," he admitted, frustration evident. "But I have a lead. We need to look into their financials. They're laundering money through legitimate businesses around town, using those fronts to keep their empire funded and protected." He looked Jack in the eye, his gaze steely. "And they're using some of the same businesses that were supposed to support vets like you and Mike when you got back." The revelation hit Jack like a punch to the gut. The very institutions that should have helped veterans transition back to civilian life were entangled with the gang, and the realization deepened his resolve. He could feel the anger simmering just below the surface, fueled by the thought of Mike's life being cut short by the very system meant to protect them. The next day, Jack and Cooper met in a small, unmarked office Cooper had secured away from prying eyes. Stacks of documents cluttered the desk as they combed through financial records, searching for discrepancies that would reveal the hidden connections between Red's gang and the city's higher-ups. Hours passed as they sifted through the numbers, each line revealing a clearer picture of the insidious corruption woven into Bakersfield's fabric. It was nearly dawn when they stumbled upon their first break, a record of a massive cash deposit into the account of a high-ranking police official. The money had been funneled through a chain of local businesses, all supposedly small, struggling enterprises, now clearly shown to be laundering points for the gang's illicit profits. Cooper's eyes hardened as he looked at the name on the bank statement. "Captain Tom Harlow," he muttered. "I always suspected, but never had proof. He's been turning a blind eye to the devils for years." Jack felt a chill settle over him. Harlow was a respected figure in the force, someone who had been lauded for his contributions to the city. If he was compromised, then the rot went far deeper than they'd anticipated. Jack clenched his fists, the weight of their discovery sinking in. They were fighting not just a gang but a system that protected it at every level. As they strategized their next move, Jack knew they had to tread carefully. Harlow was dangerous. Any misstep could alert him to their investigation, putting both their lives at risk. They needed a plan to expose him without tipping him off. Cooper suggested an undercover operation, tailing Harlow and documenting his interactions, gathering enough evidence to confront him publicly, where he couldn't deny the allegations without scrutiny. Their preparations were interrupted by a sudden knock on the office door. Cooper and Jack froze, exchanging a tense glance before Cooper cracked the door open, revealing a junior officer, visibly nervous. "Sarge, I thought you should know. There's been talk. Captain Harlow's been asking around about you. He wants to know why you're spending so much time with Miller." The young officer's eyes darted between them, his voice barely above a whisper. "Be careful." As the officer left, Jack turned to Cooper, tension crackling between them. They both knew Harlow's inquiries meant they were dangerously close to exposing something big, and he knew it. The clock was ticking, and if they didn't move fast, they could lose their chance to dismantle the Red Devils operation. The following night, Jack and Cooper staked out the Old Rusty Bar, which had become a hub of activity for the gang's dealings. From a discreet distance, they watched as Red arrived, accompanied by men they hadn't seen before, men in suits who didn't fit the usual biker mold. Jack's instincts went on high alert. These men looked like the kind who didn't soil their hands with street crime. They were there for business, protected and hidden by layers of authority. Cooper observed through binoculars, his face growing grimmer. "That's Councilman Royce. He's been pushing 4 urban revitalization funds in Bakersfield for years," he said, disgust lacing his voice. "It's all a cover for funneling money to the gang." Jack's jaw clenched. It was worse than he'd thought. Local politicians were not only covering for Red but actively funding his gang under the guise of public projects. They watched as Royce handed Red a thick envelope, their casual exchange betraying the ease with which they operated. Jack felt his blood boil, but he held his position, knowing they needed concrete evidence. Cooper's phone buzzed with a text, and he glanced down, eyes widening. "Harlow's on his way here. We need to get out now." They quickly retreated to avoid detection, but the weight of what they'd seen hung heavy between them. They were up against forces far more powerful than they'd anticipated. Back in the safety of the unmarked office, Jack looked at Cooper, his voice filled with the grit of conviction. "We can't let this go on, Ray. Harlow, Royce, all of them need to be exposed." Cooper nodded, but his face was shadowed with worry. "This won't be easy, Jack. They're protected by the system. If we go after them, we'll be putting a target on our backs. They'll come after us with everything they've got." Jack's gaze was steely, unwavering. "Then let them come. I've faced worse than dirty cops and crooked politicians." He took a steadying breath, feeling the weight of his promise to his fallen friend. "For Mike, and for every person they've terrorized, we need to do this." Their plan took shape over the following hours. They'd use what little evidence they had to bait Harlow, forcing him into a public confrontation that would implicate Royce and, by extension, the Red Devils. It was a dangerous gamble, but Jack was prepared for the fallout. He'd come back to Bakersfield for justice, and he wouldn't leave until every last one of them was exposed. As they finalized their preparations, Jack felt a calm resolve settle over him. The days ahead would be brutal, but he was ready. The night of the operation arrived quickly, and Jack felt the tension building as he and Cooper prepared for the high-stakes takedown of the Red Devils at Old Rusty. This time, they had a team of trusted officers waiting in the wings, ready to move in as soon as they gave the signal. They had tracked Red's activities over the past week, and all signs pointed to a major transaction going down that night, one that involved not only Red's gang but also several of Bakersfield's power players. As they parked a block away, Cooper turned to Jack, his face etched with worry and determination. "Jack," he said, his voice low but intense, "if this goes wrong, there's no telling how far they'll go to cover this up. We're facing more than just bikers tonight. Royce, Harlow, they'll do anything to protect their interests. Jack nodded, his expression unyielding. I know. But this ends here. We can't keep letting them tear this city apart. The memory of Mike, of all the friends he'd lost, weighed heavily on him. They're not just hurting strangers, Ray. They're tearing families apart, just like they did to Mike's. Cooper placed a steady hand on Jack's shoulder, nodding firmly. Then let's make it count. For Mike, for everyone. With silent determination, they approached the bar, each step measured, every movement calculated. Jack led the way, scanning the area, his senses sharpened. As they reached the door, they could hear muffled voices inside. Red's, low and authoritative, interspersed with the laughs and mutters of his cronies. They slipped in quietly, staying out of sight as they positioned themselves at the edge of the room, waiting for the right moment. Inside, Red was deep in conversation with Royce and Harlow, their demeanor casual yet focused, discussing details of what sounded like a large shipment arriving in the next few hours. Jack's pulse quickened. They had walked straight into the heart of the operation. This was their chance. Cooper gave the subtle signal to the team outside, alerting them to get ready. As he turned back to Jack, a flash of movement caught his eye. Snake, one of Red's men, noticed them lurking near the entrance. His face twisted with recognition, and he moved to alert Red, but Jack was faster. He lunged, grabbing Snake and slamming him against the wall with a quiet but brutal force. Snake's eyes widened in shock before he slumped, unconscious. But the commotion drew Red's attention. He looked up, his expression darkening as he saw Jack and Cooper standing in the shadows. "Well, well," Red sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. The soldier and his little friend, playing hero again. Royce and Harlow exchanged tense glances, visibly thrown by the unexpected confrontation. Harlow's face contorted with fury, his polished public facade cracking as he stepped toward Jack. "You're making a mistake, Miller," he growled, his voice seething with anger. "You don't understand who you're dealing with. We have more power than you could ever imagine." Jack's voice was steady as steel. "I understand perfectly. You've used that power to protect criminals, to destroy lives. But it ends tonight." He gestured toward the doors, where officers were beginning to file in, surrounding the bar's exits. Red, undeterred, let out a low, mocking laugh. "You think you can just walk in here and shut us down? This town is ours, Miller. And nothing you or any of these cops can do will change that." Jack stepped forward, his eyes locking onto Red's with a deadly focus. "Maybe you're right, Red. Maybe you've run this town for too long. But people like you only get away with it until someone stands up." Without another word, he launched himself at Red, and the room exploded into chaos. The bar became a battleground. Jack fought with the precision of a seasoned soldier, every move deliberate and powerful. He blocked Red's punches, countering with swift, brutal strikes that left no room for error. Red, fueled by rage and desperation, fought back with raw aggression, swinging wildly as he tried to gain the upper hand. But Jack's resolve was unbreakable, every punch and kick an outlet for years of pent-up frustration and grief. Meanwhile, Cooper led the officers in securing the rest of the gang members, maneuvering through the melee with tactical precision. Royce tried to slip out, but Cooper intercepted him, pinning him against a wall. "You're not going anywhere, Councilman," Cooper said coldly, snapping handcuffs onto his wrists. Royce's face twisted in anger and fear, realizing too late that his political influence wouldn't save him tonight. Harlow, caught off guard and outnumbered, attempted to escape through a side door, but two officers blocked his path. Enraged, he turned back toward Jack, drawing a hidden weapon. "This isn't over, Miller," he shouted, raising the gun. Jack's gaze sharpened as he saw the gun aimed at him, and in one fluid motion, he dodged and disarmed Harlow, wrenching the weapon from his grasp and sending him reeling backward. Harlow stumbled, crashing into a nearby table, and Jack pinned him with a glare of pure contempt. "You betrayed everything this uniform stands for," Jack said, his voice low and deadly. "And you'll answer for every life you've ruined." Red, battered and barely able to stand, made one final lunge at Jack, his face contorted with hatred. But Jack anticipated the move, sidestepping and delivering a final, crushing blow that sent Red sprawling to the ground, defeated. The room was silent as the officers moved in, handcuffing the remaining gang members, including Red and Harlow, who both glared up at Jack with barely concealed venom. As the officers led the gang members and their corrupt allies out, Cooper turned to Jack, his face weary but relieved. "We did it, Jack. It's over." Jack nodded, feeling the weight of the night's events settle over him. He looked around the bar, taking in the wreckage, the shattered alliances, and the remnants of a once powerful gang. The battle had been hard fought, and the cost had been high. But as he watched Red and Harlow being escorted away in cuffs, he felt a deep, quiet satisfaction. Outside, the dawn was breaking, casting a pale light over the city. For the first time in years, Jack felt a sense of peace, knowing he had fulfilled his promise to Mike and to everyone else the Red Devils had terrorized. Cooper clapped a hand on his shoulder, a silent gesture of respect and camaraderie. "Bakersfield owes you one, Jack," Cooper said, his voice thick with emotion. Jack shrugged, a faint smile crossing his face. "I didn't do it alone. And there's still a lot of work to be done. But maybe now, this city has a fighting chance." With that, they walked out of Old Rusty, leaving behind the shadows of a long-fought battle. The morning air in Bakersfield was crisp and quiet, as if the city itself had taken a breath of relief. For the first time in years, there was a sense of calm in the streets. Jack stood on the steps of the police department, watching as officers moved in and out, their expressions carrying a new weight of purpose. Word of the takedown at Old Rusty had spread quickly, and with Red, Harlow, and Royce behind bars, the city seemed to buzz with a cautious hope that things might finally be changing. Inside, Jack was met with nods of gratitude and respect. Officers who had once turned a blind eye or were too afraid to act were now stepping forward, asking how they could help continue the work he had started. Jack felt a strange mix of pride and humility. He hadn't come to Bakersfield looking for recognition, only justice for the lives lost and a fresh start for the city. In the days following the operation, Bakersfield held a ceremony honoring Jack and Sergeant Cooper for their bravery and unwavering dedication. People from all over the city gathered in front of City Hall, clapping and cheering as the two men accepted their plaques. It was a powerful moment, one that symbolized the city's recognition of Jack's sacrifice and Cooper's integrity. As Jack looked out over the crowd, he spotted families who had been victims of the Red Devils, now standing tall with hope in their eyes. Their faces reminded him of why he had fought so hard to bring down the gang and their allies. Mayor Torres stepped up to the podium, his voice carrying over the crowd. "Today, we honor two men who refused to back down in the face of corruption and violence. Because of their courage, Bakersfield can begin to heal, and our city can once again be a safe place for everyone." The crowd erupted into applause, and Jack exchanged a proud, knowing look with Cooper. It was an acknowledgement between friends who had walked through fire together and had come out the other side. After the ceremony, Jack and Cooper visited Ray's partner, Officer Delaney, who had been instrumental in rallying trusted officers to their side. Together, they reviewed plans to continue rooting out corruption within the department. Jack knew that even though the worst of the battle was over, the city's wounds would take time to heal. There would be other gangs, other threats, and it would take ongoing vigilance to keep Bakersfield from slipping back into the darkness. Days later, Jack received an unexpected call from Chief Inspector Walsh, who offered him a permanent role within the Bakersfield Police Department. The proposal took Jack by surprise, and for a moment, he hesitated. He had come to the city with a mission and hadn't planned to stay. But as he looked around at the faces of those who had fought beside him, he felt an undeniable pull. This city needed leaders who wouldn't be swayed by fear or corruption, and maybe, just maybe, he could find a new purpose here. The following week, Jack donned the uniform for the first time. The weight of the badge felt different from the medals he'd worn in the Marines. It was a symbol of trust, a responsibility he didn't take lightly. He and Cooper were assigned as partners, a team determined to uphold the promise they'd made to clean up the city. They patrolled the streets together, gaining the trust of the residents, who had grown wary of the law in recent years. As they walked through the neighborhoods, people greeted them with nods and friendly smiles. Children who once avoided the police now waved as they passed. Jack felt the satisfaction of seeing the impact of their work firsthand. The city's transformation was slow, but steady, each day a small step toward restoring Bakersfield to its former spirit. One afternoon, Jack visited the small memorial he had set up for Mike, a simple plaque in the park near Mike's old neighborhood. He placed a hand on the plaque, remembering his friend's smile, his laughter, and the sense of loyalty they'd shared. He whispered, "It's done, Mike. They can't hurt anyone else. Not here." The wind seemed to carry his words, and he felt a weight lift from his shoulders, knowing he had honored his promise. In time, the bar Old Rusty was shut down and repurposed as a community center, a place where people could gather for support and a sense of safety. Jack and Cooper often visited, speaking with local kids and offering guidance, helping to build a future where young people wouldn't need to turn to gangs for a sense of belonging. Jack became a mentor to some of the boys, teaching them about responsibility, discipline, and resilience, instilling in them the values that had guided him throughout his life. Cooper, too, found new meaning in their work. The years of service he had given to a fractured city were finally paying off, and he felt a renewed sense of pride in his badge. Together, he and Jack became pillars of the community, symbols of a justice that was fair and incorruptible. They worked tirelessly, knowing that their presence could inspire others to stand up against crime and corruption. Months passed, and Bakersfield continued to heal. With the Red Devils dismantled and corrupt officials removed from power, the city saw a new era of leadership take root, one that valued integrity and transparency. Mayor Torres worked closely with Jack and Cooper, ensuring that changes within the department were upheld, that officers were trained to serve and protect the people, not exploit them. On a crisp autumn morning, as Jack and Cooper prepared for another day of patrol, Cooper looked over at Jack, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You know, we make a good team," he said, his tone light-hearted. Jack chuckled, nodding in agreement. "I'd say so, Ray. Wouldn't want anyone else watching my back." They shared a moment of quiet camaraderie, the bond between them strengthened by the battles they had fought side by side. As they walked out into the morning light, they felt the peace they had fought so hard to bring to Bakersfield, knowing that they were part of something bigger than themselves, a renewed hope that Bakersfield would remain a safe haven for those who called it home. In the years that followed, Jack and Cooper continued their work, a steadfast duo with an unbreakable commitment to justice. Bakersfield's streets grew safer, and its people, inspired by their dedication, took an active role in protecting their community. The city had a new spirit, one built on trust, resilience, and the knowledge that heroes didn't have to wear capes. They just needed the courage to stand up and do what was right. For Jack, his journey had come full circle. He had returned to the city to honor his fallen friend, and now he had found a home, a purpose, and a family among those he protected. As he looked out over the city, he knew that Mike would be proud. Bakersfield was a city reborn, and Jack Miller would be there to protect it for as long as it needed him.